Hey guys, how's it going? Greetings from my house. It's late at night, and I'm going to talk you through PowerPoint on the Cold War. We're going to pause periodically, throughout this. So you can make sure that we get all the notes captured. I'll definitely move faster than maybe we would in class, but pause it. Make sure we write the notes down. Make sure we get it all taken care of, and make sure you guys are paying attention and doing a good job for Mr. Pickering. It's difficult being a sub, and I trust you guys to do your best. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the Cold War, and the Cold War is one of those things. It's really fun, really interesting to talk about. World War II ends. All right, World War II ends. Hitler gets defeated. Hitler ends up killing himself. The United States chose during World War II to ally themselves with Russia, and we talked about what that meant. All right, the idea of befriending someone that possibly was even worse than Hitler. All right, killed millions of people in Russia, but yet the United States allied with them in order to defeat Hitler. We thought Hitler was the bigger enemy. We chose to side with Stalin in order to take him down. There's lots of things that happened towards the end of the war that showed the Americans that, hey, Russia cannot necessarily be trusted. All right, Russia came after the United States a little, or tried to beat the United States to Berlin, beat the United States to several other cities in order to take control of them. And we're going to find out that Berlin ended up being a pretty interesting debate throughout the Cold War, the entire process. So anyway, why call it the Cold War? Now, it's called the Cold War because technically there was no fighting between the United States and Russia. All right, that's why it's called a Cold War. All right, there was technically no fighting. Now, I use the phrase technically because if we know anything about war, we know that there are other ways to fight. There are other ways to get things done. And there were definitely moments of battle, all right, where the United States went after Russia, or the United States went after specifically communism in order to take communism down throughout the world. So, although we call it the Cold War between the United States and Russia, there was still lots of battles to take place and lots of things to talk about. All right, so let's talk about this. June 26, 1945, the war is over. 50 nations meet in San Francisco and sign a charter establishing the United Nations. The United Nations was put in place to promote peace throughout the entire world. It was a way that if there were issues going on in the world, they could come to the United Nations, they could discuss, and the United Nations would rule on what they thought was most appropriate, what they thought should be done. The current United Nations sits in this city. Anybody know it? New York. Good job. All right. Maybe you got it, maybe you didn't, but it's New York. All right. Very cool. This is fun. It's unique. It's awkward for me too, but hopefully it'll make it so we can understand this stuff. All right. So anyway, New York City is where the current United Nations sits. And like I said, if a country has issues, they ask to meet in New York at the United Nations and discuss their problems. All right. Very cool. The Potsdam Conference. The Potsdam Conference took place in Potsdam, Germany, and it was a meeting between the United States and the Soviet Union. And this is where things start to kind of fall apart. So Stalin, the Soviet Union, had promised Roosevelt that he would allow free elections throughout Poland. Now remember, the Russians came through Poland in order to get into Germany. The Russians were promised Poland by Hitler, or at least half of Poland, by Hitler as part of the non-aggression pact. Hitler went back on his promise. Stalin goes back on his promise to the United States. Stalin says, nope, sorry, no democratic parties in Poland. Poland is going to be communist. This makes Truman upset right from the get-go. He realizes that his assumptions of Stalin were right. He couldn't trust him. Truman wanted countries to have what was called self-determination. Underline this word, and you can see I can do some of these things too. It's kind of cool. Highlight or underline this word, self-determination. This is an important word because, for one, it's two words. Self, meaning you or a group of people. Determination, the factor is determine. All right, they want to self-determine the government that's best for them. It's a governmental term that you should get to decide what type of government your country should have. All right, self-determination. Truman wanted all the countries taken over during World War II to have self-determination. Stalin says, no, Poland is ours. We're going to take control of them. if you have watched the news over the last couple years, you know that the Soviet Union is still doing some of these things where they're taking over countries and not allowing them necessarily to choose what they want for themselves. Self-determination is a huge, huge part of what we're currently seeing in the United States. All right, next slide. Containment. Underline, star, put something huge that you will recognize this word containment. At this point, the United States realizes that Russia is going to be a problem, and they know that Russia is ideally communist. All right, when I say ideally, that means that's their ideology. That's what they believe. They believe in communism. The United States believes in capitalism, democracy. Those two don't get along very well. Well, George F. Kennan, who is an American diplomat in Moscow, proposes an idea called containment. He says, okay, America, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take whatever measure necessary in order to prevent communist rule in other countries. We're going to let Russia be Russia, but as far as the other countries of the world, we are going to try to prevent communism from spreading into other countries. Now, for a second, I want you to think about what are ways to prevent communism from spreading. Obviously, you have war. All right, you can go and fight and prevent it from happening. The other way is money, and the United States tries this first. And this is where we get part of the Cold War aspect of what happened. The United States throws millions of dollars, and in today's money it would be trillions, but they threw millions of dollars to countries in order to keep them from falling into communism. This becomes the main policy of the United States for really about 50 to 60 years, where we practice the idea of throwing money to countries in order to prevent them from falling into communism. And we do get into some battles. You know, we know about Korea War, we know about the Vietnam War. We do get into some battles, but essentially our goal is to contain communism to just Russia, all right, to not let it spread out anywhere else. All right, very cool. You don't need to write down this huge statement here, but there's an interesting statement made by Winston Churchill shortly after the Potsdam Conference. He says that Europe is now divided into two political regions. You have a democratic Western Europe and a communist Eastern Europe. What most people don't understand is that the Cold War wasn't just between the United States and Russia. It was actually between the Western countries and the communist countries. And when I say the Western countries, countries that practice democracy, all right, the United States, Great Britain, France, these were all countries that now were democratic countries, crazy heavyweights in terms of military in the United States and in the world, and then these communist countries, Russia and Russian-backed countries. Winston Churchill makes this statement in a speech that tags this phrase, the Iron Curtain. And it's kind of a cool symbolism for what happens in the United States. But he tags this phrase called the Iron Curtain. It says this: a shadow has fallen upon the scenes so lately by the Allied victory, talking about World War II. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Atlantic, an Iron Curtain has ascended across the continent. Behind that line lay all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in the Soviet sphere. Keep this word in your head. Sphere. And all are subject in one form or another not only to the Soviet influence, but to a very high and increasing measure of control from Moscow. Moscow, Russia, wanted to control countries. They wanted to make sure that they had as many countries on their side as the democratic countries had on theirs. And it becomes this tense battle for who can gain more support. All right, and it's called the Iron Curtain. That's what Winston Churchill calls it. If you ever have the opportunity, I know I say this a lot, but if you ever have the opportunity and you go to some of these countries of Eastern Europe, they're beautiful, and you will notice that what Churchill says here, all these famous cities, you can see the old ancient cities like Prague, Budapest, Bratislava, all right, all these famous cities that were in Eastern Europe. They have a old city and they have a very communist sections of the city, and there you can tell it's very distinct. All right. On March 12th, 1947, Truman asked Congress for $400 million in aid for Greece and Turkey. Now, I told you the first way that we were going to contain communism is by throwing money at the situation. And it was called the Truman Doctrine. All right, Truman asked Congress for $400 million in order to send money to Greece and Turkey, and he felt that this aid would allow these countries to resist the spread of communism. Think about how communism works. Communism is basically looking towards poor people in poor countries and saying, you have no food, you have no job, I will give you these things in exchange for work. All right, I'll give you a house, I'll give you food, I'll give you all the things that you need, not necessarily the things that you want, but I'll give you all the things that you need to survive if you just follow our lead. All right, so poor countries, communism is really appealing. All right, you feel like, oh my gosh, I don't have food, I don't have a place to stay. Communism gives me those things, all right, for minimal effort. We felt if we give countries money, they can disperse that to people and kind of get them on their feet, get the economy rolling a little bit. All right, invest that money into something, invest it into a business. All right, put it into a bank. All these different things that people in these countries could do with money. New jobs, new infrastructure to build. Put people to work building roads and bridges. That's what infrastructure is. All right. Going back to this, I want to draw your attention real quick. If I ask you this question on a test, I want to tell you how I remember it. Truman Doctrine. For me, T for Truman, T for Turkey. The money went to Turkey, all right? And then Turkey has Greece in it. I don't know. Just helps me remember. The second plan we're going to learn about is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was directed by Secretary of State George Marshall, and he wanted to provide money to any European nation in need. So it's an expansion of the Truman Doctrine. It says we want to provide money to any European country that might need it. And this is interesting statement that he makes. He says this is not against country or doctrine. He understood that people reading this in the newspaper in Russia reading this were going to say, oh my gosh, they're trying to defeat communism. Well, in fact, he wants to put that rumor to rest by saying this, not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Now, I'm telling you right now, he knew what he was doing. He's a smart guy, and he was doing this to fight communism. All right, he was doing it specifically to keep communism out of these countries in Europe. That was his only goal, his number one goal, to keep communism out. But he uses, because this sounds a lot more attractive to print in a paper, that it's not against communism, it's against hunger and poverty and desperation and chaos. He's able to gain more support and he's able to gain more money, all right, in order by saying it this way than if he were to come out and say, hey, this is to stop communism to the rest of the world. All right, very cool. 16 countries in Europe received over $30 billion in aid. $30 billion in aid is a massive amount in 1945, 1950. All right, a ridiculous amount. $30 billion is a ton of money today, but that would be an astronomical amount of money at the time. So just keep that in mind. It was a huge amount of money. The Communist Party begins to lose its appeal in Eastern Europe, and honestly, every country every country west of Berlin is able to fight off communism. All right, so it is successful in fighting off communism. One city that really kind of was hurt by this issue of the Cold War was the city of Berlin. All right, the city of Berlin. And I'm going to do something. I'm going to attempt to do this on my computer, but I'm going to try to draw what's happening. All right, so I'm going to talk through this briefly. I'll come back to the slide, but I'm going to draw this on another piece of paper. All right, so after World War II, Germany, the country, is split into 4 regions. Each region is occupied by one of the big 4 countries during World War II. Great Britain gets a chunk, France gets a chunk, the United States gets a chunk, and the Soviet Union gets a chunk. The capital of Germany is also split into 4 different zones. All right, so again, Germany gets a chunk of Berlin, France gets a chunk of Berlin, the United States and the Soviet Union each get a chunk of Berlin. Well, shortly after World War II, France, Great Britain, and the United States say, listen, let's unify our territories and let Germany decide what they want to do and what's best for them. Stalin, however, refuses to give up his territories, and he specifically refuses to give up his territory in Berlin. Now, I'm going to draw this on a map, so I'm going to come over to this blank piece of paper here. All right, make this big for us to see, And I'm going to draw, hopefully, thought I was going to draw. Okay, hold on. All right, change my mind. I'm going to show you on this map. This is a lot better anyway. I move my face up there. See? All right, anyway, you can see over here, this is what Germany looked like, the country after World War II, how it was divided. All right, you had the Soviet-controlled area here, you had the British-controlled, the French-controlled, and then the United States-controlled. Now, like I mentioned, shortly after World War II is over, these three countries decide to unify into and become one. However, the Russians refused, and the Russians actually had the city of Berlin in their sector. So the major city of Berlin was inside of the Soviet sector. So if you look down here at this picture, this shows how the city of Berlin was actually divided. All right, you had the American sector, the British sector, and the French sector. Well, what did they need to do? Okay, so this becomes an issue. The Soviets decide to not unite the rest of the country. Okay, the Soviets decide not to unite the rest of the country, and their goal was to keep these other countries outside of Berlin, because the Soviets felt that if they could control Berlin, then eventually the rest of the country of Germany, who has always been loyal to the capital of Berlin, would fall to them. All right, so they decide to cut off everybody from coming into the Soviet sector. So they decide to basically put people on the border to cut the railroad lines, to patrol the streets in order to prevent anybody from coming into their sector. Their goal was to shut off all supplies into Berlin in order to take control of all of Berlin. All right, that was their goal. They wanted to take control of all of Berlin. All right, so that they could eventually take control of all of the country. So we have this problem. All right, we have the Germans who are in control of half of the city of Berlin, who are in control of this territory that is not allowing anybody in, so the Americans can't get supplies to their sector of Berlin, the British can't get supplies to their sector of Berlin, and the French can't get supplies to their sector of Berlin. So we're stuck with a problem. Germany isn't allowing supplies to come to these people, and their goal is to starve them out. They're saying, okay, let's not let supplies come into these people. Let's force these people to ask for our help, and once they ask for our help, we got them. All right, it's game over. It's done. Well, the United States comes up with a plan. The United States says, listen, let's fly in and let's bring supplies and just fly planes into Berlin nonstop. All right, as many days as it takes, let's just continue to fly planes into Berlin in order to prevent Berlin from falling to the Germans, or to the Russians. So they come up with a process called the Berlin Airlift. I'll go to the next slide here. And for almost a year, the United States flies planes into Berlin in order to keep 2.1 million people fed. All right, 2.1 million people were living in Berlin, and they only had enough food for 5 weeks. The goal of the Russians was to starve them out so that they were forced to come to Russia for help, and essentially the whole city would fall to Russia. Well, the United States, for 327 days, flies planes 24 hours a day, 277,000 flights, and delivers 2.3 million tons of supplies into Berlin. They brought food, fuel, medicine, and even Christmas presents during the Christmas season. All right, that plane cruise, it says here that plane cruise bought with their own money. By May of 1949, the Soviet Union lifts the blockade and allows the Western countries into Western Berlin only. Creates a problem that we'll address later with the Berlin Wall. But essentially, the Soviet Union realized that, hey, unless they want to fight the United States, Great Britain, and France, they kind of have to allow those countries into Berlin. Going back to this map, they have one road. That's it, that they allow these countries to come into. after the Berlin airlift. All right, very cool. NATO put a huge star circle by this. We still have NATO today. But NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's made up of 12 members that they decide to pledge military support to one another in case there's an attack. It was essentially a huge treaty by 12 different countries. The United States is kind of the spearhead behind this, and ironically, it's the first time the United States enters into a treaty during peace, right, when there's no war even to be fought. They did it as a preemptive strike against communism. They wanted to figure out what countries supported democracy and what countries supported communism. Now, I told you, the Russians were always seeking to find balance between communism and democracy. So when the democratic nations form NATO, you can assume that the communist nations are going to form their own little pact, and they do. The Cold War starts to heat up. Now, I told you the Russians and the United States never really fight directly. However, there is still fighting, and it first starts in a country called Korea. In China, there's someone by the name of Chiang Kai-shek. He's a nationalist leader who's supported by the United States. He, however, upsets the Chinese people by instituting a grain tax during a famine season. So a famine means there's not enough rain. When there's not enough rain, there's not enough food, and yet Chiang Kai-shek decides that he's going to tax people on producing grains, any types of grains, right? Rice or wheat or whatever. Another leader, Mao Zedong, was a communist leader. And this communist leader attacks Chiang Kai-shek, saying, hey, this is bad. We should divide the wealth equally, all the things that a communist would say to people who are starving. The United States sends over $2 billion in aid to Chiang Kai-shek, but it still wasn't enough. All right, China is about to fall to communism. All right, North Korea, which is here on the map, was backed by the Soviet Union. And on June 25th, 1950, North Korea decides to cross the 38th parallel, which is right here, all right, the 38th parallel, into South Korea. All right, so North Korea attacks into South Korea. Now, South Korea is democratic. All right, North Korea is communist. All right, now, you might be asking, Mr. Humphrey, we were just talking about China, now we're talking about North Korea. I don't get it. What's this matter? Well, I'm going to show you right here. At first, the communist North Koreans seem unstoppable. All right, Douglas MacArthur pushes the North Koreans, comes in, pushes the North Koreans to the brink of defeat. All right, so going back to our map, you can see here, this is the point. The Koreans advance, and then we are able to push them back to nearly the brink of defeat. We are about to defeat the North Koreans. Imagine how history would be changed today if this had turned out differently. But we are about to defeat the entire country of North Korea. And something happens. Something very significant happens. China decides to aid North Korea and push the Americans back to the 38th parallel. The Korean War ends with no real change, but it completely destroys our relationships with North Korea and with China. Think about this. Let's go back a slide here. We had just sent China $2 billion in aid. $2 billion, all right, in order to help them. It doesn't work, all right. The country falls to Mao Zedong, and now China is fighting the United States to help a communist friend. It shows you kind of where loyalties lie. Communist countries support communist countries. Democratic countries support democratic countries. All right, regardless of nationalist loyalties. All right, they support ideologies first, it seems. It is a huge slap in the face of the United States to see that China chose to help North Korea. How the world would be different now is unmistakable if you know anything about what North Korea is doing. North Korea is vowed to attack the United States today. They're building nuclear missiles. They claim to have a nuclear missile that's almost capable to reach the western seaboard, and they claim that they will use it whenever they can. Pretty scary stuff in 2016. Could have been stopped in 1950 had China not aided North Korea. Moving on though. The Korean War ends with no real change. Everything goes back to normal. We are now a demilitarized zone at the 38th parallel, and North Korea and South Korea still don't get along. We still back South Korea pretty heavily, and North Korea, again, has vowed to destroy us. So take that for what it is. All right. MacArthur versus Truman. Now, MacArthur is this decorated war hero. All right. He's the hero of World War II. All right. He was responsible for all the Pacific battles, all the success in the Pacific. And he is extremely upset that China came to the aid of North Korea, and he requests from Truman to attack China. He says, listen, that was mean, that was wrong, they disrespected us, whatever you want to say, they didn't do what they were supposed to do. And he requests to attack China. Truman refuses, all right? And MacArthur, in the newspaper, decides to publicly criticize Truman, saying, hey, I asked for this, Truman said no. Well, on April 11th, 1951, MacArthur is fired, and it's a pretty big deal. All right, MacArthur was a decorated war hero who's now being fired. It was not a pleasant time in history. All right, you never want to think badly of anyone who's sacrificed or given their life towards war, and MacArthur had obviously done more than his fair share. And he gives this famous statement. It says, "Old soldiers never die; they just fade away." Pretty amazing quote just about life in general. It's like. You just kind of fade into the background and are ultimately forgotten. It's kind of sad, kind of tragic at the same time, but a really famous quote given by MacArthur about his firing. All right, you've made it halfway. We're possibly close to the end of time, so you might be doing this notes tomorrow, but if not, we'll keep going. All right. Very cool. So what was going on at home? When I say the Cold War at home, I mean what was going on in the United States. What did the United States look like during the Cold War? Let's check it out. Major things were happening in the United States, and crazy unconstitutional things were happening in the United States. First off, the United States was scared to death of communism invading into the United States. So they created a group called the House Un-American Activities Committee, whose sole purpose was to find un-American things that people were doing. Now, if you know anything about the Constitution, we have freedoms in the United States, the freedoms to live how we want to live. So there technically is no such thing as un-American. You are allowed to live within the constraints of the law how you want to live. So if you want to be communist, you have the right to be communist. The government did not like that, so they created a group called the House of Un-American Activities Committee, and their goal was to investigate communism in the United States. And one place that they tried to attack more than any other was the movie industry. And you might say, what on earth? Why were they attacking the movie industry? That doesn't make sense. Well, movies at the time were where people got all their information from. It's where they watched the news. It was the most popular form of entertainment. You went to the movies whenever you could during the 1950s. It was just what people did. So they felt that if the communists were going to try to get information to people, they were going to use movies to do it. So the HUAC, which is what the House Un-American Activities Committee stands for, the HUAC decided to investigate the movie industry to figure out if they were using the movies to influence the people here at home. There was a really famous case called the Hollywood 10. 10 men were called to testify by the HUAC, but they refused. They said, listen, this is unconstitutional. If I want to be communist, I have the right to be communist. And because of that, they were sent to prison. All right, major backlash for this. Being sent to prison because you were violating what the HUAC said didn't make sense to a lot of people. They said, listen, if I want to live this way, I can live this way. If I want to be communist, I can be a communist. And they really set an example. Well, as a result, there was what we call the blacklist. All right, a list of people who are condemned of having communist backgrounds. And roughly 500 actors, writers, producers, and directors were all placed on this blacklist, and they couldn't find work. All right, they were deemed as being communist. Whether they were or not, we don't know. But they were said to have been communist and couldn't find work. All right, a really kind of strange time in U.S. history for sure. All right, next slide. The McCarran Internal Security Act. So we talked about how the HUAC, they looked at the movie industry. The McCarran Internal Security Act made it unlawful to plan any action which could lead to a totalitarian state in the government. Now, we talked about what this phrase totalitarian meant. All right, essentially, it made it unlawful to plan any action which could lead to communism. Now, this statement is extremely vague. What is an action that could lead to a communist state? It could be, you know, writing a paper. It could be talking to your neighbor in a weird way. The government used a lot of subjective thinking into determining whether people were communist or not, and it's going to hurt. All right, it's going to hurt people in the United States pretty heavily, and it's going to scare people. It's going to keep people from saying anything bad about the government because they didn't want to be deemed as being communist. Truman does veto the bill, and that's important to note, but Congress overrides him. And next year in government, you'll learn about how the president is able to be overridden by Congress. But the McCarran Internal Security Act literally gave the government free rein to attack people however they wanted in the United States and say, hey, we think you're communist. We think you're communist. We think you're communist. And they continued to attack these people. All right. Here's an example. Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was accused of espionage. All right. He was accused of selling secrets to the Russians. However, there was really no evidence of him giving information to the Russians, and so it literally would have made it impossible to charge him with espionage. But under the McCarran Internal Security Act, they decided to charge him with perjury, meaning lying under oath, saying that he was lying about being a spy. Well, think about this. Innocent until proven guilty. They've proved nothing. They haven't proved that he's a spy. They can't prove that he's lying, but yet the government was allowed to put him in jail for perjury, saying that, oh, he lied about being a spy. I know there's no evidence, but he lied. Trust us. And they put him in jail. Now, to be fair, Alger Hiss was probably selling stuff to the Soviet Union, but evidence-wise, all right, in the legal system, the way it's written, there's no reason he should have ever been put in jail. All right, very cool. The Rosenbergs, another example. All right, the Rosenbergs were accused of giving information. Here, I'll move my face again. The Rosenbergs were accused of giving information on the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. They were found guilty and executed. And in fact, there was evidence to suggest that the Rosenbergs did sell information to the Soviet Union. However, Judge Irving Kaufman, who was the judge for this case, decided to send them to execution. And Judge Irving Kaufman declared that their crime was worse than murder. So I want you just to think about this for a minute. Maybe take a couple minutes to talk with Mr. Pickering about it. But do you believe that this crime was worse than murder? All right, is this something that's worse than murder, selling the atomic bomb? All right, so take a few minutes, and then I'll kind of tell you my piece. So pause me, whatever it takes, and we'll go. All right. Okay, here's my thoughts on it. I believe, yeah, it probably is worse than murder because the selling of the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union carried the capabilities of killing millions of people. The United States at this time is the only country that has the technology of the atomic weapon. We know what it's capable of at this point, and yet that information slips into the hands of our worst enemy, an enemy that wants to take us out, that wants to take other people out, and it puts us in a pretty scary time in history. A stalemate of nuclear war. McCarthyism. All right, McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy was an anti-communist activist, and he decided that he was going to accuse, using the McCarran Internal Security Act as his backing, he was going to accuse one person after another being communist. And he really had no rhyme or reason. He just decided to point people out and says, you're communist, you're communist, you're communist. It may be something as simple as their curtains were red. It may be something as ridiculous as a statement that was made, in a paper that you wrote for a high school English class. He was using the most subjective information to just accuse people of being communists. And it worked for a while. It scared people into talking bad about the government at all. However, television was his downfall. There was a nationally televised investigation that showed McCarthy bullying witnesses. He attacked people, said negative things about them, literally bullied them into giving the information that he wanted. And he literally was told by several people, even within government, that he brought dishonor to the Senate. And in 1957, he died from alcoholism. And a lot of people believe that he died because of how he interacted with people. He was so paranoid about communism spreading that he drank himself to death. He drank to forget. He drank to not think about communism spreading throughout the United States. He drank to subdue his paranoia, and it ultimately killed him. Pretty tragic, pretty sad story, but it shows how paranoid people were in the United States of communism spreading. All right, cool. Brinkmanship, highlight, circle, major word. All right, major word. Brinkmanship means the willingness to go to the edge of all-out nuclear war. Now, we knew now what the atomic bomb was capable of. When we dropped it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we didn't. All right, and there's stories upon stories upon stories of us dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the pilots crying, and the people watching this crying because they had no idea what it was actually capable of. Now we know. We've tested it, we've seen it, and now we know. And in fact, on November 1st, 1952, we test a new type of atomic bomb, the H-bomb, hydrogen bomb, and we find that it's equivalent to 1 million tons of TNT, meaning it's 67 times the power of Hiroshima. All right, the same bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima, this bomb is 67 times more powerful. And we know the damage that the bomb did in Hiroshima, this one could do that times 67. A massive weapon to have developed by the United States. And now, under the policy of brinkmanship, we are willing to go to the edge of all-out nuclear war, meaning that we would consider using a bomb that would destroy a city 67 times over, because that's what we should do. All right, people were scared, people were paranoid, and it's really starting to show. Very cool. Keep going. The CIA. Awesome. If you ever want to watch some good movies about the CIA, a lot of the content the really good content you get will come out of the 1950s. The CIA was developed in the 1950s in order to spy on other countries and gain information about them. How they did it was extremely intellectual, secretive, all the things that you would expect from spying on someone else. Infiltrating other organizations, infiltrating other countries. There's examples of us basically embedding ourselves in Russian agencies. Pretty amazingly interesting things that the CIA did, throughout the 1950s, 60s, and even today, that they still do in order to gain information about people abroad. But we developed the CIA in the 1950s in order to gain mainly information about Russia, and we use it pretty substantially during the 1950s. Great movie if you ever want to watch, called Bridge of Spies. Check it out. It just got released on Blu-ray, so I'd watch it. Very cool. Remember I had talked about NATO, and I said the goal of the Russians was always to combat and balance democracy. The Warsaw Pact does this. The Warsaw Pact is an attempt to balance the growing power of NATO. And it's a pact that links the Soviet Union with 7 other European countries, which they call satellite nations. And these nations were Eastern European countries which relied on the Soviet Union for support. The Soviet Union gave these countries money, supplies, food, resources in order to keep them communist. Much like the United States gave money to keep countries democratic, Russia was doing the same thing. They wanted to keep the scales balanced. They wanted to make sure that countries supported them so that they wouldn't just be attacked. All right. So the Warsaw Pact. Put a star next to it. Know that the Warsaw Pact. All right. The Warsaw Pact is in response to NATO. All right. NATO. All right. Very good. The Eisenhower Doctrine. So we have the Truman Doctrine, we have the Marshall Plan, and now we have the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine says that the United States would defend the Middle East, all right, the Middle East against attack by a communist country. This right here, the Eisenhower Doctrine, is still affecting us in 2016. Iraq, Iran, ISIS, Syria, all of these issues that we are dealing with in 2016 go all the way back to the 1950s and doctrines like the Eisenhower Doctrine. It says the United States would defend the Middle East against attack by communist countries. Well, that happens. We actually support tribes within Afghanistan, within Iraq in order to fight off the Russians trying to go into those places. And as a result, we end up training people like the Taliban. You could argue, hey, does this work? Is this something we should continue to do? It's the essence of government. Everything is trial and error. You don't know, and you can never think to predict the outcome. But this is unfortunately, what we've seen and what's happened. Very cool. U2, not the band. No, you guys might even be too young for U2, the band, but still U2. U2 planes were planes that were used during the 1950s to spy on other countries. They were high-level airplanes that flew extremely high, extremely fast, and we flew them over Russia very regularly in order to gain information. A few slides ago, I mentioned the movie Bridge of Spies. Bridge of Spies is about this event. On May 15th, 1960, Gary Francis Powers is flying a U-2 plane over Russia, taking pictures, and his plane is shot down, and he is captured and kept by the Russians. Tensions begin to escalate between the Soviet Union and the United States. All right, extremely high level tensions. Now watch the movie. I'd really encourage you to watch it. It's a great movie. All right, but it shows the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union and what we do to actually get Francis Gary Powers back. We do get him back, but it takes us trading people to the Russians in order to get him back. Nikita Khrushchev comes into power shortly after Stalin's death. And he's a little bit different than Stalin. In fact, he's a lot of bit different than Stalin. And he decides that he wants communism to take over the world, but he wants it to take over the world peacefully. And we have a slight... Oop, my computer's going to shut down. Hold on. Hang with me. Awesome. Sorry, guys. That's what happens when you do this late at night. Cancel shutdown. Awesome. Okay, back. Go back here. We're almost done. You can see it's the last slide anyway. But Nikita Khrushchev, he wants to take over the world, but he wants to do it peacefully. He wants to make sure that wars don't break out. But he still pushes the envelope. So don't think of him as a super nice guy, a guy that wants peace for the world. He just wants to take over the world, just wants to take it over in a diplomatic way as opposed to a fighting way. All right. Hope you guys enjoyed taking notes this way. I know it's different and unique and awkward, but it's awkward for me too. So miss you guys. Hope you guys are having a good time, and we'll do this again soon. All right. Thanks.